Flaxborough's annual autumn harvest social had always been a matter of local enthusiasm, far outstripping its actual grandeur. The event was held in the parish hall, a building that managed to look both draughty and overheated at the same time, like a retired gentleman determined to maintain propriety despite gout in both legs. The room smelled richly of cinnamon buns, chrysanthemums, and the faint, metallic tang of the council's folding chairs, which had been retrieved from their yearly slumber in the vicarage cellar. At the centre of the hall, beneath a green and orange bunting that drooped with the gentle melancholy of autumn itself, sat the attraction of the evening, a vast table of pumpkins, each grown in Flaxborough fields, polished till they gleamed, and arranged in ascending order of girth. Their size varied from modestly domestic to profoundly architectural. The largest, belonging to Mrs. Patience Lofbury of Rosemead Lane, had been placed on a reinforced trestle and, though no one said so aloud, was the most exciting thing the town had produced all year. It was near this pumpkin, some time after the raffle for a hamper of baked goods, but before the Women's Temperance Choir attempted a medley from South Pacific, that the whisper occurred. No one claimed to have seen the whisperer clearly. Those present spoke of a shape, though whether male or female, tall or stooping, warmly or poorly dressed, opinions diverged with the cheerful ferocity one could only expect of Flaxborough residents discussing someone else's business. But what was agreed upon was this. Someone had leaned toward Mrs. Lofbury under pretence of admiring the great pumpkin and murmured, "We all know what you hid in that field." Mrs. Lofbury, who had for decades held herself with the mild hauteur of a woman who owned a small but notable share in the local coal agents, did not react dramatically. She did not faint, nor gasp, nor drop her handbag. Instead, her spine stiffened by what seemed a single vertebra, and her eyes acquired the still, shiny look of one who has been reminded of something unpleasant at an inopportune moment. Within 3 minutes, half the hall knew something had happened. Within 6 minutes, they knew approximately what it might have been. And within 10 minutes, some were convinced that Mrs. Lofbury had buried either a husband, a love letter, a sum of misappropriated council funds, or a rival's cat, given the town's history. The last seemed most plausible. The Women's Temperance Choir began their medley in the key of C, though the altos evidently preferred D and the sopranos suspected a distant E. The resulting harmonic effect suggested a train entering a tunnel, but louder. From his unobtrusive place near the refreshments table, Inspector Purbright observed everything with pleasant neutrality. He held a cup of weak tea, which he had deliberately chosen as a means of ensuring no one would try to improve it with sherry. Purbright had the sort of face that conveyed gentle interest and no personal threat, which was, as it happened, his most effective investigative tool. He noticed Mrs. Lofbury avoiding the pumpkin display now, hovering instead near the notice board advertising lost umbrellas, 3, a misplaced child's cardigan, yellow, knitted buttons mismatched, and the upcoming council election. She appeared to take great interest in the cardigan, though Purbright suspected it was merely an excuse to avoid eye contact. At that moment, Sergeant Love approached, wearing an expression that suggested he had encountered something more serious than the choir's attack on Rogers and Hammerstein. "Sir," Love whispered, as though delivering news of delicate espionage.
"There's been a situation."
"Involving pumpkins," Purbright nodded mildly. "So I gathered." Someone whispered something to Mrs. Lofbury. She's shaken. She refuses to speak of it. But Mrs. Phelps overheard her say to Councillor Drabble that she knew this would come back sooner or later. Which,
"If you ask me," Purbright did not ask him. Instead,
he allowed his gaze to drift toward the darkened windows beyond the hall, where the autumn fields lay in quiet darkness. The great pumpkin patch owned by Mrs. Lofbury sat just past the hedgerow at the far end of Marsh Lane, close enough that, on a night like this, the faint smell of earth and wet leaves lingered on people's coats, Something had indeed come back. But what? Purbright smiled very slightly, an expression so small that Sergeant Love missed it entirely. "Well," Purbright said, "perhaps we should take a walk to the field tomorrow morning. The pumpkins won't be going anywhere. And if anyone else had hidden something among them, that would not be going anywhere either." By the following morning, the whisper had grown into something far larger and considerably more interesting than the truth itself, whatever that happened to be. The people of Flaxborough had never needed much encouragement to discuss each other's affairs, but a mysterious insinuation at a public function was, by local standards, nothing short of a civic festival. At Soper's Bakery, where the queue always seemed longest when there was no particular reason for it to be long, patrons exchanged opinions with a seriousness usually reserved for the judging of Victoria sponge texture. Mrs. Day, who always requested just a thin slice while keeping a sharp eye that it was neither too thin nor uneven, quietly informed the baker that Mrs. Lothbury's reaction wasn't what one would expect from someone entirely innocent. The baker, kneading dough with a rhythm that suggested irritation inherited from several generations of bakers before him, replied that innocence was not a strictly necessary quality for social acceptance in Flaxborough, only the appearance of it. He did not add that he once saw Mrs. Day steal a currant bun. He believed this information would be more valuable later. Over at the hedgerow post office, meanwhile, sorting of incoming parcels was slowed considerably by Mrs. Frobisher's insistence on speculating aloud. She was certain, she said, entirely certain, that the whisper concerned that business with the allotment boundaries in D8. Though she could not say precisely what the business was, or indeed who had been involved, she recalled hearing someone say it had been not quite above board. She nodded meaningfully at this, as though the memory of the not quite above boardness might return at any moment if she stared hard enough at the sorting shelf marked "Fragile, do not drop." Further down High Street, Councillor Drabble had already adopted the air of a man whose sense of tragedy had placed him at the centre of community crisis. He repeated to anyone who would listen that Mrs. Lothbury had spoken to him in the gravest terms, which he felt implied his own importance in the matter. He did not disclose that the conversation had been interrupted by the choir's stumbling attempt at a key change, or that Mrs. Lothbury's tone had been closer to irritation than confiding anguish. And so the situation developed in much the way Purbright might have anticipated it would. The fewer the facts, the more generous the speculation. Inspector Purbright, in contrast, began his morning quite calmly. He enjoyed a breakfast of toast and marmalade, read the weather report, a mild drizzle expected, continuing indefinitely, an outlook that echoed Flaxborough's personality, and made his way to the police station at a pace that did not suggest urgency, but did not rule out purpose. Sergeant Love awaited him in the office, looking as though he had grown opinions overnight and was eager to share them. "Morning, sir."
I've asked around.
"People say the whisper might have something to do with Mr. Lothbury, the late Mr. Lothbury, that is."
Past 15 years ago.
"Supposed heart trouble." Purbright murmured, removing his coat. "Many things are supposed." "Yes, sir. Though Mrs. Barkwith says she always suspected something unusual. Apparently Mr. Lothbury disliked root vegetables strongly, said they gave him indigestion."
And yet his wife insisted on growing pumpkins of substantial girth. Purbright paused halfway to his desk chair.
"You think a man's dislike of pumpkins may have hastened his death?" Love blinked. "Well, Mrs. Barkwith seemed to think so. Yes, Mrs. Barkwith often seems to think so." Love nodded. Chastened but not entirely discouraged, Purbright sat, folded his hands lightly and considered the ceiling. It was not that he lacked urgency. Rather, he preferred clarity to excitement, and clarity had a habit of arriving only after excitement had tired itself out. "Let us begin," he said eventually, "by calling on Mrs. Lothbury. A respectful visit. No inquiries, just a general interest in her welfare after last evening." Love brightened. Understood. Shall I put the car round? No, Purbright replied. We shall walk. In Flaxborough, walking allowed one to be seen walking, an essential form of communication. Rosemead Lane was a narrow street of brick houses whose windows seemed always to contain lace curtains of long-standing judgment. The Loftbury home, a square, prim structure, stood halfway down, surrounded by a garden that appeared to have been weeded during periods of stern, emotional reflection. Mrs. Loftbury answered the door before they could knock, either by coincidence or design, though Purbright silently suspected the latter. "Inspector," she said, in a tone that suggested she would have preferred a parish vicar or a less observant man. "Sergeant," they were shown into a sitting room of tidy severity. One could imagine dust presenting itself for discipline. Purbright allowed a polite silence before speaking. "We wondered how you fared after the harvest social, Mrs. Loftbury. I believe there was some
mild unpleasantness, her lips compressed.
Idle talk. Someone thought themselves amusing, that is all." "Yes, gossip can sometimes be inconsiderate," Purbright agreed. "One hears such curious things, and yet one hesitates to believe any of them without understanding the context." Mrs. Loftbury hesitated. Very slight, barely perceptible. "But Purbright noted it. I have nothing to hide," she said, which was precisely the thing one said when one wished not to discuss what one had hidden, and more importantly, whether it had ever been found. Purbright rose after the appropriate number of minutes had passed. He made no mention of pumpkins, no mention of whispers, no probing questions, which made Mrs. Loftbury more uneasy. As they stepped outside, Sergeant Love glanced at Purbright hopefully. "Useful, sir?" "Quite," Purbright replied. He did not elaborate. The pumpkin field lay at the end of Marsh Lane, bordered by hedges that had grown thick and impenetrable over many autumns. The soil was damp, the pumpkins recently harvested, leaving neat mounds of dark earth like punctuation marks in a sentence not yet finished. Purbright walked slowly, hands in coat pockets, studying the ground as though it might volunteer history of its own accord. And then Love stopped short. "Sir, look." Near one of the recently lifted pumpkin beds, half pressed into the soil, was a small brass button, ornate, old-fashioned, and out of place among the rough farmland. Purbright regarded it without bending. "A curious thing," he said softly.
"Something so small."
"But one wonders who wore a coat like that, and why they walked here recently." He watched the field, he watched the hedgerow, he watched the quiet distance where secrets settle. Then he smiled, politely, faintly, privately. The whisper had roots. If Inspector Purbright had a single investigative principle, it was this: people reveal the most when they believe they are revealing nothing at all. Accordingly, he made it a point to call on those who had attended the harvest social, not with notebooks and accusations, but with the disarming civility of a man who never rushed anyone to the truth. He began with Mrs. Phelps, a woman whose talent for overhearing was matched only by her inability to keep what she overheard. Her parlour smelled strongly of lavender furniture polish and the faint sourness of boiled cabbage, a scent she believed communicated domestic competence. "Tea, Inspector?" she trilled, already pouring. Purbright accepted with a practised gratitude. Sergeant Love, who was less adept at disguising the painful civility required for Mrs. Phelps's tea, found himself with a cup before he could form an objection. Mrs. Phelps perched on the edge of her chair, awaiting invitation to speak, while radiating the confidence of someone who considered herself indispensable to the correct functioning of the town's information systems. "I was present when the whisper occurred," she began, with the solemnity of a historian recalling a battle. Standing not 3 feet away,
I could feel the atmosphere shift.
there was a tension in the air, like a violin string drawn too tight. Purbright said encouragingly, though he suspected the tension had more to do with the choir's ongoing dispute over pitch, And what impression did you form of the speaker?
He asked. Oh, well, that's just it. I didn't see the face. Only the back, dark coat, hat brim lowered. Could have been a woman.
Could have been a man.
Could have been any number of people. Yes, Purbright murmured.
Flaxborough is well supplied with people. And I'm not one to speculate, Mrs. Phelps continued, with a sincerity that would have been touching had it been true. But it seemed very pointed,
as though whoever said it knew something.
Something Mrs. Lothbury has hoped to keep quiet. Love leaned forward. Do you know what that might be, Mrs. Phelps? Mrs. Phelps's eyes glowed.
Not exactly. Which meant she had theories, many, all unburdened by evidence. She lowered her voice.
I have always thought she was rather particular about that pumpkin patch. Too particular. One hears things, Inspector. About late nights, lamps in the field, sounds. Purbright did not ask what sounds. He suspected the next hour of this conversation would occur anyway, if permitted. Instead, he rose gently. Thank you, Mrs. Phelps. Most enlightening. Mrs. Phelps's hunger for further significance was evident.
Oh, Inspector, should you need anything else, I shall be sure to return, Purbright said,
with the politeness of a man who absolutely would not. Their next visit was to Mr. Tanner, caretaker of St. Cyprian's churchyard and unofficial historian of all matters rotting, decaying or otherwise returning to the soil. Mr. Tanner was a narrow fellow with the complexion of someone who had spent most of his working life negotiating with uncooperative weather. He was trimming a yew hedge with slow, thoughtful movements, as if the hedge might object strongly if startled. Morning, Inspector. Good morning, Mr. Tanner. A lovely hedge, thank you. It's fighting me today. Know something's amiss? Purbright tilted his head. Oh? The caretaker nodded toward Marsh Lane. That pumpkin field's troubled land.
Soil's too heavy. Holds things.
Doesn't give them back easily. Love looked uneasy.
You mean water?
Among other possibilities, Mr. Tanner replied. He returned to clipping, each snip a punctuation mark. Purbright let the silence settle. He knew that silence was often the only key needed to unlock long-stored opinion. Mr. Tanner obliged. 15 years back, he said. Mrs. Lothbury planted her first big pumpkin there the autumn after the funeral.
Odd timing, I always thought.
People grieve differently, to be sure, but there's something particular about soil when grief's involved. Those pumpkins grew unnaturally well. Love shifted, unsure whether agriculture had moral implication. Purbright simply nodded. Fascinating how the land remembers. Oh yes, the land always remembers. It was unclear whether Mr. Tanner referred to memory of nutrients or of secrets. Either explanation had storytelling potential. Their final stop of the morning was the public house, the Green Hart. It was early enough that customers were limited to those for whom daylight offered no dissuasion from beer. At a corner table sat Mr. Sidney Quarles, amateur historian, occasional handyman, and part-time author of stern letters to the local paper. He greeted Purbright with the theatrical melancholy of a man appointed custodian of civic decline. Inspector. The town has gone to seed, I fear. In what sense? Purbright asked, taking a seat. In the moral sense, whispers, secrets, the erosion of decency. Quarles sighed into his glass. Once a man could trust his neighbour. Now we whisper at pumpkin shows, Purbright allowed a sympathetic expression. Did you observe anything relevant at the harvest social? Quarles's eyes sharpened. I observed that Councillor Drabble was in quite a hurry to escort Mrs. Lothbury home.
Odd, don't you think?
Were they close associates? Purbright asked mildly. Oh, I wouldn't say close. Quarles smiled thinly. But they have shared interests over the years. Committee appointments. Allocation of parish maintenance funds. There were rumours, you know. Purbright did not know. And Quarles, thrilled, leaned in. About a will. The late Mr. Lothbury's will. Some say there was a second version.
One that vanished, Love blinked. Vanished where?
Well, Quarles spread his hands. Where do things vanish in this town? Into drawers, into fires, Into the fields, Purbright did not smile, though inwardly he acknowledged the town's talent for melodrama, disguised beneath respectability. "Thank you, Mr. Quarles, most helpful." Quarles bowed his head as though he had performed a public service. Outside, Sergeant Love exhaled. "So we've got rumours of a buried will, suspicious pumpkins, and someone whispering threats. Sir, is any of that actually evidence?"
"No," Purbright said, starting down the lane.
It is only Flaxborough, which in his experience was often enough, because beneath the gossip, the pride, and the gentle veneer of civility, someone, somewhere, knew exactly why that whisper had been spoken, and they were not gossiping. Not yet. The Flaxborough Town Council met in the upstairs room of the municipal building, which had once been used for light calisthenics classes in the 1920s and still bore the faint echo of clapping exercises. The chairs were uncomfortable, the windows stubborn, and the clock above the mantelpiece ticked with the determined self-importance of a civil servant who suspected no one appreciated him. Inspector Purbright attended as a courtesy. Though courtesy in Flaxborough was a fluid concept, it generally meant, "We should like to be seen involving you, Inspector, without the inconvenience of being guided by your opinion." Councillor Drabble, seated at the head of the long, polished table, adopted the grim expression of someone called to face calamity, though the calamity in question involved pumpkins and whispers rather than flood or fire. "We must address," he announced, "the disturbance at the Harvest Social." Heads nodded. A murmur of stern community vigilance travelled around the room like a politely shared sneeze. Drabble folded his hands. "It has been brought to my attention that the whisper," he paused, "to allow the drama to ripen, may have been delivered by Mr. Osric Rudge." The name hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Sergeant Love glanced at Purbright. Purbright, for his part, merely blinked once. Slowly, Mr. Rudge was a reclusive farmer, owner of a small and overgrown holding on the fringe of Flaxborough's fields. He was widely regarded as peculiar, though this opinion arose from two facts. He preferred the company of soil to that of people. He walked at night. In Flaxborough, such habits placed a person just a short conversational turn away from superstition. Councillor Hartigan leaned forward importantly. "Rudge has always had an unhealthy interest in Mrs. Lochbury's pumpkin patch. I've seen him lingering by the hedgerows, watching, muttering." "Many people mutter near hedges, Councillor," Purbright observed. "Hedges tend to encourage it." There was a faint twitch in the corner of Drabble's jaw. "Surely, Inspector," he continued in a measured tone, "you cannot deny that Mr. Rudge's behaviour is suspicious."
"The man is irregular," Purbright allowed himself a mild smile.
"In my experience, Councillor, regularity is not a universal indicator of innocence." This was met with polite bafflement. Drabble cleared his throat. "The town needs reassurance. Action. The whisper has caused distress, quite undeserved distress.
I might add, to a respectable woman of standing." This statement was met with murmured agreement,
though two of those murmuring had been telling others only yesterday that Mrs. Lothbury's chrysanthemums always looked just a little too vigorous to be natural. Purbright inclined his head.
"I understand."
"And I will, of course, speak with Mr. Rudge, quietly, without assumption of guilt." This was not what the council had hoped to hear. They preferred closure, swift, tidy, and untroubling, to the delicate architecture of local hierarchy. "But," Drabble pressed, "there is also the matter of the, button Sergeant Love discovered." The room brightened with interest. "Yes," sighed Councillor Abney. "That button. Very telling." Purbright shook his head gently. "Buttons are notoriously uncooperative witnesses. They rarely confess." The silence that followed suggested that several councillors were unsure whether they were being mocked. Purbright rose. indicating the meeting was near its natural conclusion. "I will visit Mr. Rudge this afternoon," he said. "In the meantime, I recommend we refrain from spreading speculation. It tends to multiply." This was met with the solemn expressions of people already planning whom to tell first. The path to Rudge's farm wound past the old mill pond, now thick with lily pads and gossip about drowned cousins from decades past. The fields here were less tidy, less mannered than Mrs. Lothbury's. The hedgerows bristled rather than trimmed. The gate leaned, but did not fall. Mr. Osric Rudge himself was found sitting on a three-legged stool beside a hen coop, repairing the latch with methodical care. He looked up as Purbright and Love approached, not startled, not guilty, merely mildly inconvenienced. "Morning," he said, in a voice gravelled by weather and lack of conversation. "Good morning, Mr. Rudge," Purbright replied pleasantly. "We wondered if you might spare a few moments." Rudge gestured to two overturned crates. "Sit then, long as you don't mind chickens." Love minded chickens, but sat anyway. One eyed him with evident mischief. Purbright did not circle the matter. "There was an incident last night."
"At the harvest social?" Rudge raised one eyebrow. "I heard,"
something whispered.
"Folk are busy about it." "You were seen near Mrs. Lothbury's field last week," Love added. Rudge grunted.
"I walk the lanes at night. Helps the joints. And the dog likes it." There was no dog visible. Purbright noticed the absence, but he did not comment. "And the whisper?" Purbright asked gently. Rudge met his gaze calmly. "If I've something to say to someone, Inspector,
I say it in daylight, proper-like, and I don't speak behind no pumpkins." Purbright believed him, not because of the content,
but because of the delivery, steady, unembarrassed, without performance. Flaxborough liars tended to speak in decorative flourishes. Rudge continued after a moment. "You want to know about that field?"
"Ask the one who's always watching it," Love blinked.
"You mean you?" "No," Rudge pointed his chin toward town.
"Councillor Drabble."
"He's got more interest in that patch than any farmer ever did." Purbright exchanged no glance with Love, no nod, no flicker, but something had shifted, only slightly enough. As they walked back toward town,
Love broke the silence first. "You think Rudge didn't do it. I think," Purbright replied,
"that the council wants him to have done it. And that's not the same thing." "No," Purbright said. "It rarely is." He did not say more. He did not need to, because somewhere between pumpkins, whispers, vanished wills, and the quiet dignity of a man repairing a hen-house latch, the case had tilted. Someone
had pointed the town at Rudge. Someone who needed
Mrs. Lothbury to remain untroubled. Someone who knew exactly what had been buried in that field, and why it was dangerous for it to be remembered. The small brass button, cleaned of its clinging soil and placed upon a sheet of notepaper on Purbright's desk, looked at first glance like nothing of consequence. Buttons rarely announce themselves as meaningful. They are modest objects, content to hold things together without being noticed for doing so. But this particular button was ornate, its pattern of intertwining leaves and scrollwork suggestive of an older style of tailoring, the sort of thing one might find on a coat intended to imply a certain level of
dignity, whether or not such dignity was
deserved. Sergeant Love regarded it with the solemnity reserved for objects that might yet prove to be evidence. "Do we know who might own such a coat, sir?"
he asked. "In Flaxborough?"
Purbright replied mildly. "More people than you might think. Respectability here is often something one puts on rather like a garment that does not quite fit." Love frowned, suspecting philosophy had taken the place of practicality. Purbright lifted the button. No maker's mark, but the style is Edwardian replica, not original. Possibly part of a modern garment made to look older. Theatrical even, Love brightened. "The Amateur Dramatic Society?" Purbright nodded. Exactly the sort of costume piece they would hoard in crates and mothball with lavender sachets. "And Councillor Drabble directs their productions, doesn't he?" "Somewhat officiously," Purbright said. One might even say enthusiastically, Love blinked. So the button could be his. It could, Purbright agreed, which was, of course, not the same as is. To verify the matter, Purbright suggested a brief, purely social visit to the town hall's attic, where the Amateur Dramatic Society stored its costumes. The attic was accessed by a steep flight of stairs that seemed expressly designed to dissuade frivolous investigation. Dust floated in slow, dreamy drifts. A faint scent of mildew and starch hung in the air. Sergeant Love, in an attempt at assistance, opened a heavy trunk with the enthusiasm of a man who believed evidence came neatly labelled. It did not. Inside were costumes from several decades' worth of theatrical ambition, Tudor bodices stitched by someone who had clearly lost patience halfway through, Roman togas made of bedsheets, cloaks of questionable velvet, and hats that had not been fashionable since the reign of any monarch worth mentioning. Purbright examined them slowly. Not the garments themselves, but the buttons. Most were plain. Some were missing entirely. But then a coat, dark wool, slightly threadbare along the cuffs, and fastened with buttons matching the one found in the pumpkin field. Purbright looked at the coat, not with triumph, but with mild curiosity. Inside the collar was a faintly inked name. Drabble, C. Sergeant Love inhaled as though a confession might fall out of the pocket. Purbright shook his head gently. All this means, Sergeant, is that Councillor Drabble has access to the coat, not that he wore it recently, nor that he, if indeed it was he, whispered anything at all. But it's something, Love insisted quietly. Oh yes, Purbright agreed. It is something, and Flaxborough thrives on somethings. He folded the coat back into the trunk precisely as he had found it. Not evidence. Not yet, just a thread. Threads are most useful when allowed to dangle. Leaving the town hall, they walked across the square just as Mrs. Patience Lothbury herself emerged from the greengrocer's, carrying a paper bag filled with carrots and a dignity that seemed slightly more brittle today than usual. She noticed them and paused. There was a faint tremor in her fingers, not fear, but anticipation, the defensive sort, the sort worn by those who suspect they are being judged and are determined to remain superior to the process. Inspector, she greeted, composed but with the tiniest hesitation. Sergeant, Mrs. Lothbury, Purbright replied pleasantly. We were admiring the seasonal produce. This was a harmless remark, meaningless chatter, but it unsettled her nonetheless. People expecting accusation often find politeness more frightening. If this foolish gossip continues, she said abruptly, I shall write to the newspaper.
I will not have my name dragged into village sensationalism. Of course not, Purbright said. But, she continued, voice tightening, one cannot help what others choose to recall or misconstrue. Purbright gave no sign of interest, which made her speak again. There is nothing buried in that field. Love blinked. We didn't mention... Purbright touched his sleeve once.
And he fell silent. Mrs. Lothbury realized her misstep, her mouth pressed into a line as straight as a knitting
needle. She walked away, not hurriedly, just precisely the
way one leaves a room after having said too much. They walked towards St. Cyprian's rather than return to the station. Purbright was not done thinking. Love waited for the inspector to speak. Purbright eventually did. Sergeant, have you ever noticed that when something is accidentally unearthed, literally or figuratively, it is rarely the object itself that unsettles people?
Love considered this.
Then what is it, sir? The memory attached to it? Love frowned. The meaning someone remembered something they shouldn't? No, Purbright said, smiling slightly at the autumn air. Someone remembered something they desperately hoped everyone else had forgotten. They paused at the churchyard gate. It was peaceful here. Leaves drifted in slow spirals. The stones bore names that no longer provoked gossip, no longer held scandal. Time had smoothed them clean. People don't bury objects, Sergeant. Purbright continued softly. They bury moments, Love looked down at the path, thinking this over, and sometimes, Purbright concluded, the earth gives them back. They walked on. That evening, the town settled into the warm quiet of lamps and drawn curtains. The gossip, like steam from a kettle, softened into murmurs, and in the window of a tidy brick house on Rosemead Lane, a silhouette stood perfectly still, Mrs. Lothbury, watching the direction of the pumpkin patch. Not with fondness, not with loss, but with fear. Very slight, very controlled, but unmistakable. The rain arrived overnight, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred chimney tops and turned the cobblestones slick and dark. Flaxborough looked particularly introspective in such weather, as though the town had retreated into its own thoughts and preferred not to be disturbed. Inspector Purbright found the morning's post on his desk when he arrived at the station. Most of it consisted of routine correspondence, but one letter, handwritten in a carefully tidy script, was accompanied by a note from the constable on duty, delivered by hand. Sender did not leave a name. Purbright examined it without opening it. The handwriting was neither agitated nor flamboyant. It had the calm patience of someone accustomed to being ignored, and therefore careful to present no reason to be dismissed. He opened it. Inspector Purbright, I believe the matter you are looking into concerns the Lothbury estate and particularly the second will that was said to exist at the time of Mr. Lothbury's passing. I do not ask to be involved. I merely wish matters to be resolved quietly before certain people suffer needlessly. You would do well to speak with Miss Ada Fernwell. She knows more than she has ever said aloud. A concerned Citizen Purbright read the letter twice. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in his breast pocket. Sergeant Love, arriving with newspaper and a faint smell of buttered toast, noticed the movement. Something new, sir? Possibly, Purbright replied. He did not elaborate. He rarely did, at least not immediately. Miss Ada Fernwell lived in a small cottage by the river, the plaster walls slightly buckled from age and damp. The garden thick with foxgloves that appeared to have grown without reference to human planning. She had once served as housekeeper to the Lothbury family in the years before Mr. Lothbury's death. She opened the door at Purbright's knock with the expression of someone accustomed to visits from church committees. Not police inspectors. Miss Fernwell, Purbright began.
Hat in hand, may we trouble you for a moment of your time?
Her eyes, very pale blue and very sharp, flicked between him and Sergeant Love. She stepped back. No invitation. Just allowance. The sitting room was modest but impeccably neat. Nothing unnecessary.
Nothing left idle.
A life arranged into order after long practice. Purbright took the seat she indicated. Love found his own and tried not to sit on an embroidered cushion which he suspected carried sentimental importance. Purbright spoke gently. Miss Fernwell, you were in service with the Lothbury household some years ago. Yes. And you remained until shortly after Mr. Lothbury passed. Yes. Her answers were simple, but her posture was not. Her hands rested on her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone keeping them from trembling. Purbright waited. People fill silences for their own comfort, and indeed, after a moment, I was very fond of Mr. Lothbury, she said, not dramatic.
Not sentimental.
Just a fact placed on the table between them. And Mrs. Lothbury?
A longer pause. She keeps order.
She values propriety, which was the politest way possible of saying anything else. Purbright nodded.
And there was talk at the time of a second will. Her hands tightened, not enough to shake.
But to whiten the skin at the knuckles, there was, she said, quietly. With different terms. Love leaned forward slightly. Different how, Miss Fernwell? Ada Fernwell stared into the fireplace, though it was cold. Mr. Lothbury wished to leave a portion of the estate to his sister's daughter, a girl who had grown up with very little.
He believed it just.
He believed she had a right to some comfort in life. And Mrs. Lothbury did not agree, Purbright said. Miss Fernwell did not answer. She did not need to. The silence filled itself. Love exhaled softly. So the second will disappeared. Before the solicitor could examine it, Fernwell said. Her voice did not waver. One day it existed. The next no one had seen it.
Except me. She looked at Purbright now, and there was something behind her eyes. Not fear, not bitterness. Something older, a memory, worn, smooth. I did not speak then. I had no place to. And now?
Purbright asked gently. A single raindrop traced the window beside them. Now, she said, someone has remembered. They left the cottage in thoughtful quiet. Love spoke first, once they reached the lane. So this second will, if someone whispered about it, then the whisper was a warning. Yes, Purbright agreed, and warnings are not given without reason. He slowed his steps, watching the rain make small circles in the road puddles. People do not fear the truth being known, he said. They fear what the truth means, Love frowned. Meaning? Purbright smiled faintly. Meaning, the whisper was not meant to expose Mrs. Lothbury. It was meant to remind her that someone else could. Love absorbed.
This blackmail, he said.
Eventually, possibly, Purbright replied. Or something more sentimental, which tends to be more dangerous. That afternoon word spread, quietly, but distinctly, that someone had vandalized a gravestone in St. Cyprian's churchyard. Purbright and Love were summoned immediately. The two men approached the cemetery in the continuing rain, which fell in thin threads now like stitching across the landscape. Mr. Tanner, the caretaker, waited beneath the shelter of the yew tree.
Hat removed in solemn irritation. It's a disgrace, he muttered as they neared.
No respect these days, Purbright studied the stone. It belonged to Mr. Horace Lothbury, long dead. The inscription, beloved husband, kindly of heart. 1939-2008, but now the last line had been scratched over with a stone or knife, rough and angry, and below it, crudely added, Liar Love drew a breath. Sir, someone is saying Mr. Lothbury hid something.
Lied about something. Purbright was silent a moment. No, he said softly. They are saying someone lied about him. Mr. Tanner looked from the stone to Purbright. So what does it mean, Inspector?
Purbright studied the vandalism, not the word.
But the gesture behind it. It means, he said,
that we are no longer dealing with a whisper. He let the rain fall softly around them, like punctuation. It means, he continued, voice low, someone is angry. And anger rarely stays quiet for long. Dusk in Flaxborough had a way of settling early, as though the day had quietly decided it had done quite enough and would retire without ceremony. The lamplighter had long since been replaced by a municipal timer switch, but the street lamps flickered on as though they still required a personal request. The evening held a kind of muted expectancy, Inspector. Purbright noticed it as he walked home from the station, a slight hush in the air, a kind of listening silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a contented town. The kind of quiet in which secrets turned over, looking for a way out. The call arrived just after 6 o'clock. Sergeant Love had answered the station telephone and appeared moments later at Purbright's gate, slightly out of breath. There's been another incident, sir, he reported, out near the old mill bridge.
A break-in, and, well...
You'd better see. Purbright took his coat without asking further. Love knew by now that a well-timed detail was worth more than a hurried explanation. They walked through the dimming lanes, boots soft against the dampening gravel, until the river came into view, slow and dark beneath the stone bridge, whose arches were older than half the town's family lines. A small fishing shed stood nearby, its door hanging crookedly wood-splintered, Lantern light cast uneven shadows around it, held by Mr. Sidney Quarles, the historian and enthusiast of civic commentary, who had appointed himself witness and custodian of outrage. "I discovered it, Inspector," Quarles announced before they reached him.
"Quite disgraceful."
"Destruction of property. On sacred river ground, too. The town should enforce proper surveillance." He paused dramatically. "I myself was just taking an evening constitutional." Purbright nodded politely, though he would have wagered a week's salary Quarles had been laying in wait for drama to happen to him. "What was inside?" Purbright asked. Quarles gestured with lantern light. "Records, papers, odds and ends belonging to the Angling Society."
"And more importantly, the old register books," Love frowned.
"Register of what?"
"Membership," Quarles said impatiently.
"Subscribing members to the Angling Society going back decades. Fishing permits, fees, donations. It was an archive of no small historical interest." Purbright entered the shed. It smelled of damp rope and old tobacco. The cabinet that had held the records was open, drawers pulled out, papers scattered on the floor in careless disorder. Not rummaged for cash,
Not damaged out of spite.
searched, purposefully. Someone had been looking for something specific. Love knelt to gather fallen papers. "Anything missing?" Quarles hesitated. The hesitation revealed more than the answer. "Well, yes." Purbright waited. "The membership ledger from 2008, the year of Mr. Lochberry's death." Purbright said nothing. He did not need to. Love exhaled. The vandalized gravestone was about him, and now someone's taken the membership ledger from the year he died. "Sir, someone is revisiting whatever happened back then." Purbright stepped back outside. The river moved slowly like an old thought, and there, across the bank, someone stood. A slim shape, motionless, half hidden among reeds, watching. Love followed Purbright's gaze. "Is that—" But the figure moved away before form could resolve. A smooth retreat into dimness, as though they had never stood there at all. They crossed the bridge and followed the path toward Mill End, where cottages sat shoulder to shoulder in the deepening twilight. Yellow window light glowed from some, others dark and quiet. Footsteps ahead. Not hurried, but not idle. Purbright spoke quietly. "Miss Fernwell." Ada Fernwell paused, surprised, though not startled. She wore her raincoat and carried a paper-wrapped parcel of bread.
A simple evening errand, except that she was walking from the
direction of the river. Love looked at her too quickly, too suspiciously, and she noticed her chin lifted the smallest degree. "If you are here to accuse me of something," she said. "You will be disappointed," Purbright smiled faintly. "I am not here to accuse anyone. It is not my habit to begin by assuming guilt." She considered him a long moment. It was not mistrust exactly, more the wariness of someone accustomed to being quietly overlooked until suddenly noticed. "Someone broke into the old fishing shed," Love informed her, not unkindly. "I know," she said. "I saw the lantern from the riverbank."
"I thought perhaps there had been an accident." Purbright noted the detail. She had been walking alone, near dusk, near the river where the vandalism occurred.
He also noted the absence of fear in her voice, not innocence.
Not guilt, restraint. He inclined his head politely.
"Thank you, Miss Fernwell. Get home safely." She nodded, walked on, and disappeared into the modest warmth of Mill End. Love waited until she was out of earshot. "You think she did it?" "No," Purbright said. "But she knows who did." They made their way back toward Town Square, lamps glowing softly. Love spoke again, thoughtful now. "Sir, the ledger."
"What exactly are we looking for? A membership roll? A signature?"
"Possibly," Purbright said, "but more likely we are looking for absence. Something removed from the record."
"A name that should be there and is not." Love frowned.
"Someone who was involved in the Lothbury household."
"Or the will?"
"Or the pumpkin field." Purbright's gaze moved toward the rooftops of Rosemead Lane. "Yes, he said quietly. And perhaps someone who still is. Later that same night, the rain stopped. The clouds cleared, and the moon rose, pale, low, and watchful, reflecting faintly off the wet leaves in the pumpkin field. A soft sound disturbed the hedgerow. Not footsteps, something more deliberate. The shape that moved among the soil did so slowly, as though counting distances, recalling a place by memory rather than sight. They
knelt beside one of the old
pumpkin mounds they began to dig, not with haste, with care, as though uncovering something fragile. They paused, once looking toward town, as if checking that no one was watching, but someone was far off, standing very
still, Inspector Purbright. He
did not call out. He only watched, because sometimes, before a truth is taken into custody, it is best to let it finish revealing itself. Morning returned to Flaxborough with the apologetic brightness of sun after rain. The streets glistened, puddles reflected sky, and the air held that fresh, faintly metallic scent that suggested the world had been briefly washed clean, though human matters, of course, had not. Inspector Purbright walked to the station at an unhurried pace, noting the town as one might study a familiar painting to see what had been added overnight. At Mrs. Danbury's shop, the coal bin was being refilled. At the Crown and Cup, two early patrons argued gently about whether the weather signalled an early frost. At Rosemead Lane, the curtains in Mrs. Lofbury's house were drawn later than usual. Small details, unremarkable to anyone not accustomed to watching the edges of things. Sergeant Love was already at his desk when Purbright entered, surrounded by open notebooks, reports, and the collected fragments of gossip shaped into something nearly resembling information. "Morning, sir?"
I've made a list. Purbright glanced at the paper Love handed him.
It was headed in methodical print, "People with Reason to Care." About the Lofbury will beneath it, Mrs. Patience. Lofbury to retain the estate, Miss. Ada Fernwell, witness to the second will. Councillor Drabble, involved in estate discussions at the time. Mr. Osric Rudge, neighbour. Possible grievance. Sidney Qualls, historian. Collector of secrets. The niece, on whereabouts unsure. Not known locally. Love tapped the last line. Her name is Helen Cawthorne. We have no record of her ever visiting Flaxborough. I've checked electoral registers and railway bookings, Purbright nodded. And yet Mr. Lochbury believed she should benefit. Yes, Love said. Assuming the second will actually existed. Oh, it existed, Purbright said softly. Things that do not exist rarely vanish so completely. Love blinked. Purbright placed the list aside. Tell me, Sergeant, have you ever noticed how guilt changes posture? Love looked thoughtful.
In what way, sir?
When a person feels accused wrongly, they tend to object. They defend themselves. They become irritated or offended, Purbright paused. But when a person fears the truth itself, they become careful, quiet. They try not to cause movement.
As one handling a fragile object they dare not drop, Love nodded slowly.
You're speaking of Mrs. Lochbury? Yes, and someone else. He let Love turn that over himself. The day passed in its usual small rhythms, and Purbright spent much of it walking, not directly to any destination, but through routes where the town's habits exposed themselves. He passed the river, where Mr. Tanner was mending a fence rail. The caretaker nodded without conversation. Silence was sometimes the most articulate response. He passed the Green Hart, where Sidney Qualls was reading a newspaper as if it contained moral tragedy on every page. Purbright did not stop. Qualls would speak when the moment required it. He passed the post office, where Mrs. Frobisher was telling someone's private business loudly enough that she clearly wished to be overheard. Purbright did not pause there either. Instead, he stopped at Mill End, just at the gate of Miss Ada Fernwell's cottage. He did not knock. He only stood. There is a kind of conversation that happens without words, spoken through windows, doorways, and decisions after a few seconds. The door opened. Miss Fernwell stood inside, hands folded. She did not seem surprised. "You were at the river last night," Purbright said. "Yes." "You saw someone approach the shed?" "Yes." "You recognized them?" She looked past him toward the river. "Recognition is not always admission, Inspector." "No," Purbright agreed. "But silence can be its own statement." Her throat tightened, though her voice did not. "You understand, Inspector? That knowing something and being able to bear the consequences of speaking it are not the same." "Yes," Purbright said. "In fact, that is often the difference between guilt and grief." Her eyes flickered. He bowed his head. Polite,
"Acknowledging leaving space, I will not ask again," he said quietly. He walked away, because a person who is ready to speak will call for the inspector,
not the other way around. That evening, Purbright sat in his office after most of the constables had left. The lamplight made long shadows across the papers on his desk. He regarded the button again, not as an object, but as a link. Buttons fasten things, hold parts together, and when they fall away, the structure is loosened. A button belonging to Councillor Drabble's coat in the pumpkin field where the whisper was spoken. A ledger missing from the year of Mr. Lothbury's death. A gravestone marked with anger. A woman living her life like a room kept shut too long, and Mrs. Lothbury defending dignity instead of innocence. Purbright thought with a faint inward sigh that human truths rarely resemble legal truths. One is about what happened, the other is about what people need to believe happened. He leaned back in his chair. Something had been buried in that field. Not necessarily an object, possibly a decision, a promise,
a betrayal.
A moment when someone could have acted differently and didn't, and now someone was determined that the past should be reopened, not to punish, but to balance. People rarely want revenge. They want the world restored to the shape it should have had, even if that is impossible. Sergeant Love reappeared in the doorway. "Late night, sir?" "Only a thoughtful one," Purbright replied. Love hesitated. "Sir, do you think this ends badly?" Purbright considered. "Most things would," he said gently, "if people were not given the chance to tell the truth at the right moment." Love nodded. Not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of it nonetheless, Purbright extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow there would be a tea gathering at St. Cyprian's, a charity social event, open to all, attended by all, full of polite smiles and harmless biscuits. And in polite places, truths sometimes slip, if asked correctly. Not cornered, not accused, just invited to surface. As Purbright stepped into the cool night, he paused at the station door. Somewhere, down Rosemead Lane, a window curtain fell back into place. Some believed, Purbright said mildly, that the document was simply misplaced. But of course, documents of that significance rarely vanish without assistance. Drabble exhaled, slow and heavy.
Not confession.
Recognition of inevitability. Purbright turned slightly toward him, not accusatory, merely noticing. "You were the one who helped with the probate arrangements, Councillor. You advised Mrs. Lothbury on the legal process. You were also the one who informed the solicitor that no alternative will could be found." Drabble's voice, when it emerged, was small. "She was distraught, grieving. I thought it best not to complicate matters." Purbright nodded kindly. "Yes, that is how these things begin. A small decision, a convenience,
a tidying of the world." Mrs. Lothbury spoke then, quietly, but with steel. "He was foolish, sentimental, led astray by pity."
"I did what was necessary to preserve the dignity of our household." Purbright regarded her with the gentlest sorrow. "Dignity?" he said, "can be a costly luxury." She met his gaze. Dry-eyed, yes, and I paid it, not remorse. Just truth. Purbright moved to the window where morning light lay soft on the pumpkin patch beyond the hedgerows. "And the field," he said, "that field became your anxiety. Not because of what was hidden there, but because of what was once hidden there." Love looked up. Purbright explained. Mr. Lofbury, intending to revise the will again before finalizing it, placed the signed draft in a small metal box and buried it in the pumpkin field. "Temporarily," he said, "to keep it safe until he could speak privately with the solicitor." Miss Fernwell closed her eyes. She had known this part. Mrs. Lofbury did not flinch. Purbright continued. After his death, Mrs. Lockbury and Councillor Drabble went to that field, dug up the box, and burned the document. Together. It was not malice, not even greed.
It was fear.
Fear of losing one's rightful order in the world. He did not say selfishness. He did not need to. The room remained very still. "And now," Purbright said, turning, "the whisper." Sergeant Love breathed in. Purbright's voice remained calm. It was Miss Ada Fernwell who whispered to Mrs. Lofbury at the harvest social. No one looked surprised. Ada spoke, softly. "I had carried that knowledge for 15 years.
I thought time would quiet it.
But when I saw Mrs. Lofbury standing beside that great pumpkin, smiling, I thought, no one else remembers. No one else knows how it was." Her voice did not tremble. It ached quietly. I whispered, because I wanted her to know I had not forgotten.
I wanted her to look at me.
She never once has. Mrs. Lochbury's jaw tightened, but her gaze remained straight ahead. Ada continued. "And I vandalized the gravestone, and I took the ledger."
"And I stood in the field last night. I did all of it," Love blinked, shaken.
But not surprised. Purbright nodded. Yes. Because the ledger contained the record of Helen Cawthorne's visit to Flaxborough, a single membership entry Mr. Lochbury made for her as a gift, proof she existed in his heart, if not his will. Ada's voice was scarcely more than breath. He loved her, and no one ever speaks of her. Not once, not in 15 years.
A whole person erased. She pressed her hands together tightly.
To steady them, and I could not bear it any
longer. Mrs. Lofbury inhaled, controlled, precise. It
was necessary, she said. Ada exhaled, a slow release of a lifetime of silence. No, it was only done. Purbright said nothing. He allowed the distinction to settle. For the first time, Councillor Drabble spoke clearly, without self-importance. "I thought we were doing her a favour, keeping the estate intact, keeping the town's impression of her, weight of the household, secure. And in doing so," Purbright replied gently, "you both buried more than a document." He looked toward the field again, where sunlight fell on the turned soil. The past never stays buried.
Not truly.
Even when the object is gone, the shape of the absence remains.
And eventually someone touches that shape and realizes what is missing. No one spoke. There was no need. Everything had already been.
Said Purbright, put on his hat. There will be statements, he said softly.
And procedures.
But they will be handled quietly. I do not think there is benefit to spectacle, Mrs. Lochbury nodded once. A surrender not to guilt, but to inevitability. Miss Fernwell bowed her head, not in shame, but relief. Councillor Drabble closed his eyes. Sergeant Love stood very still, and Purbright stepped out into the morning. The pumpkin field lay quiet. The soil, dark and rich, had given back what memory had tried to keep planted. Autumn in Flaxborough moved forward with its usual steadiness.
Leaves gathered in gutters.
Chimneys resumed their gentle evening duties, and the town, having experienced a scandal of polite proportions, began the business of returning itself to its prior shape. That shape of course, was not exactly what it had been, but in Flaxborough, change arrives modestly as though apologizing for the inconvenience. Mrs. Lofbury did not withdraw from society, and she was not the sort of woman who allowed public difficulty to interfere with her place among chrysanthemums and church bazaars. She appeared at the next council reception with her usual composure, hat chosen precisely, gloves uncreased. But there was a difference. Where once conversation paused when she entered a room, a small deference to social gravity, now it merely shifted slightly, like polite water flowing around stone.
Not rejection.
Not condemnation. Just less admiration, and in Flaxborough, that was its own quiet sentence. Councillor Drabble carried himself with exaggerated briskness for several weeks, as if hoping that forward motion alone could restore his footing in civic life. He continued chairing committees, drafting unnecessary policy proposals, and writing memoranda whose only purpose was to reassure himself that he still had influence. People
Still nodded to him in the street, but they did not
pause to speak. He had joined the long list of those in town who had once been listened to, but were now merely tolerated, and this, too, was its own kind of consequence. Miss Ada Fernwell continued living in her cottage by the river. She was not charged. Purbright saw no need. The law, after all, is one instrument among many. Sometimes moral equilibrium restores itself without courtroom theatre. She planted winter bulbs that year, crocuses white and purple, and she took to walking the riverbank in early morning. Those who saw her said she seemed lighter, not happier exactly, but unburdened, a person who had carried a weight she could finally set down. One afternoon, Purbright passed her near the mill bridge. They exchanged a
nod, nothing more, but it was enough to acknowledge that neither of them expected the past to be fixed or
forgotten, only understood. The pumpkin field lay quiet again. The vines had collapsed into the earth. The soil looked ordinary. No one spoke of buried documents or whispered accusations now. Mrs. Lofbury had the field turned one final time before winter, but occasionally, when dusk sat low and soft, someone walking the lane might see her standing there, still, composed, not regretful but thoughtful, a woman contemplating the exact price she had paid to hold her life in the shape she desired. Flaxborough did not gossip loudly about her any longer. Flaxborough had moved
on, but memory does not vanish simply because
conversation does. Sergeant Love continued his work with renewed admiration for Purbright, though expressed in his usual form of hesitant silence and slightly aimless paperwork. He would, from time to time, look thoughtfully at the button in the evidence drawer, the one that had started nothing but happened to be present when everything began. He kept meaning to return it to the costume
attic. He never did. Some reminders are not burdens.
Some are simply markers of human nature observed. As for Inspector Purbright, he wrote several reports, all understated, all factual,
none dramatic. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction in having solved anything.
Because solving is the wrong word for such matters. People do not behave incorrectly because they are villains. They behave incorrectly because they are people. And the difference between those who live quietly and those who find themselves entangled in small tragedies is often nothing more than which moment they let govern them, the fearful one or the honest one. One afternoon, Purbright took his usual walk past the now quiet river. The light was low. The air smelled of apple skins and distant chimney smoke. He paused halfway across the old stone bridge. The water below moved at its customary pace, unhurried by any urgency humans might feel. He considered for a moment the curious fragility of reputations, the ease with which a life could be bent by silence or set right again by the courage to speak just once. He did not sigh. He did not smile. He simply continued his walk home. There would be another autumn social next year.
Another cake, another little mystery.
Because towns like Flaxborough do not change in great leaps. They shift leaf by leaf, and Inspector Purbright would be there, observing quietly, as he always did, patient, polite, and perpetually underestimated, which of course suited him perfectly.